Welcome back. This morning we're looking back to the last time a Labour Prime Minister resigned in office, to the resignation of Harold Wilson in 1976 and the events which followed. I'm joined again by the three senior figures from the Labour Party who've been reflecting on this: Tony Benn, Roy Hattersley and David Owen. Tony, during this period you developed a very clear set of ideas. The alternative economic strategy was evolving. You were starting to campaign about internal party democracy and so on. Did you think during this period, 76 to 79, that a space was really opening up for a different type of Labour Party, and that there was really nothing Callaghan or Wilson or anyone else could do about it, that you really thought you were onto something?
I put forward what I believed.
Yeah,
I mean, I moved to the left in government. Many people don't do that, they do the opposite. But when I saw how industrial and economic power affected my work, I said to myself, we've got to do something a bit about it. And that was why I put forward the view. And also I was concerned about party democracy, because the party leader was then only elected by MP, so the movement had nothing to do with it, and the Electoral College, which was the one that elected Tony Blair, of course, came in. And also there was the problem that MPs were just automatically reselected, and when the SDP was formed and 10 MPs joined, the local party said, we really must have the right, we've got apprentices and all that, and therefore that came in. And that combination of internal democracy and an alternative perspective about the role of world capitalism, if you like, was what made me say what I said.
David, could I ask the reverse to you? Did you sense during this period that, I mean, clearly your views hardened, solidified after the 79 election, but were you beginning to sense then that you were moving on a path which could well see you leave the Labour Party? And was there anything Callaghan or Wilson could have done?
No, not at all. Up until the 79 election, it wouldn't have crossed my mind. And indeed, for over a year after that election, it didn't cross my mind to leave. Tony's changes were not as benign as he makes them sound. I mean, we are friends and we can talk. But reselection, Tony, was, in many people's constituencies, a lever to allow the left to oust a Member of Parliament, and it was deliberately introduced. Also, you wanted the manifesto to have a sort of mandatory quality on the future government, and you were also changing the leadership of the Labour Party. Now, the combination of all three was to massively reduce the concept of a Member of Parliament being a representative and of a parliamentary party that was overall sovereign to make decisions in the interests of the country. And these were very deep issues, and in my view they kept Labour out of power for 18 whole years.
Well, I agree with the analysis of Tony Benn's position. I think there was some terrible implications of what he imposed on the party, or attempted to impose on the party, in particular the attitude towards the manifesto. I mean, what Tony wanted was a manifesto to be decided by the party conference or by some representative party conference, and then the members of Parliament, the cabinet, to be instructed how to behave. Well, you just can't have that in a democracy. I mean, that was the telling point, that was the sticking point for me, though I accepted the leader had to be elected by the whole party. But David's absolutely right that the reselection of MPs, which in a sense is right, I don't think an MP should have tenure for life, but it wasn't regarded as a democratic process. It was regarded as a way of getting rid of the people we don't like. Well, and that was terribly destructive to the party. But there's another thing, Tony, before you finish. Yeah. The other point about your proposals, your revisions, your democratisation, was even if you were right to say they were benign and just an attempt to move towards democracy, you allowed yourself to be allied with some of the most disreputable forces in the party, people who weren't like you. You took this view, no enemies on the left, and that meant that you were supported by and supported people who had not the faintest interest in democracy, who wanted a different sort of party which had nothing to do with democratic socialism.
Well, I mean, two answers there. First of all, I mean, think of the people who were expelled in the 30s. Nye was expelled. Stafford Cripps.
think of the
Wait a
people
minute.
who behaved in the
They were
70s.
expelled on
We're
the
not talking
same
about the
basis and
30s.
so on. And indeed, I followed a man, Stafford Cripps, who had been expelled from the party. Jim Mortimer was expelled from the party. So this party discipline, you don't deal with an argument by organisational means. But you see, what we've moved to, Roy, and you know this now, instead of the conference having any role in the manifesto, everything is decided by the Prime Minister.
And
the Prime Minister lays down the policy, he tells the Cabinet, he tells Parliament, he tells the conference, he tells the public. It is a monarchy. His greatest constitutional reform is to restore the medieval monarchy,
And you won't
appointing
like me
peers
saying
and
it,
controlling
Tony, but
everything.
you have some responsibility for that. You have some responsibility for that because it's the pendulum swinging in the opposite direction. Whenever one says to the Prime Minister or his cohorts that they go too far, they say, well, in your time, because of the way that Benn and Bennism was promoted, then there was too much anarchy in the party. They've gone this way because you went that way.
Right. Well, I think we've explored the parameters of that debate. We could probably continue for many hours. One of the things I want to do, I want to bring up to the sort of modern day in a way, to sort of look at the way things have changed in that period. But just briefly, in terms again of the sort of leadership of Callaghan and how you all responded to it in different ways. It's interesting, Tony, my source for this is your own diaries, which are fascinating. I mean, clearly on a personal level, you got on extremely well. But he, according to you and your diaries, at times sort of summoned you to say, look, why are you saying this? Why are you doing that? And you had some pretty tough exchanges on that basis. Was he right? I mean, do you regret now saying some of the things you said publicly, or what's your take on it?
I didn't do press briefings. I made weekend speeches, and Harold used to ring up my office and say, can we have the text of the weekend? And I used to reply saying, I don't have a text, but I'll send you a tape afterwards. And there was an attempt always to control. Harold did want to control us, and Jim would do the same. But Jim once said to me, I'm not as nice as I look. And I said, neither am I. And on that basis, we got on very, very well together. I really was fond of Jim, even though I thought his policies on the IMF were wrong. I thought the adoption of monetarism, which, as David Owen quite properly said, was the birth of Thatcherism, was Jim Callaghan, and followed on by Blair, I think has been catastrophic. But still, people have to reach their judgment according to what they think is right, and I accept that.
Could I ask you just generally, David, and I know you've made your point about the way you think the party went to the left, so we won't revisit that argument, but do you think, in a way, forget about it, 79, you clearly hadn't made up your mind, there was an inevitability about you going, or do you think, I've asked Tony whether he regrets some things, do you regret in some ways not following the Roy Hattersley line and staying put? I've asked you about this before. I mean, you could have been a force in the early days of New Labour if you had stayed put. I know in the early days you were an admirer of Blair's. I mean, you could have been right in there. But instead you left a political party, which is a huge thing to do.
Yes, I do believe the SDP was a necessary element in Labour Party coming back to its senses, and I think that they had to have their votes taken away from them, and that's what really happened in the 83 election and in the 87 election. Now, I think you had to have both. I'm afraid you had to have people like Roy Hattersley who fought the good fight from within. I don't think it would have been enough without it. I think you had to have that other lever. They had to be able to point to the left and say, look, you can't win. I remember when Michael Foot came to my constituency in the latter part of the 83 election and went out to the Council of Estates, which had been in his own constituency, and he saw them completely covered with SDP posters, hardly a Labour poster there. You couldn't go on going and depicting the SDP as some right-wing organisation. It was taking heartland Labour votes in Council Estates. Now, that meant the Labour Party had to change. Now, the trouble is they took too long to change.
Roy, could I just ask you whether in 79, when Jim Callaghan went to the country, you had a sense then that one way or another Labour would be out of power for a heck of a long time?
No, I actually thought there was a chance of us winning. It wasn't a very good chance, and I was one of the people who wanted to have the election in the previous autumn, but I didn't believe it was all up for us. I also believed that the leadership would be OK. I thought Dennis Healey would inherit. And I thought some people might leave the party, but they'd be the right people, not the wrong people. I remember coming back from the TUC, walking from the TUC with David Owen, and David said to me, I think we're all right for 3 or 4 years because Dennis is going to become leader. And I said, yes, we are. And I think actually had Dennis become leader, I think probably David, I'm not sure about the others, would have stayed in the party. Because it would have been,
Would you?
Oh,
if he'd
of course,
won in
yeah.
the 1980...
Dennis, I could have arguments with him, but he was an absolutely serious, decent, honest patriot in every possible way, and he ought to have been the leader of the party, and it was, to some extent, our fault, because one thing you have to give Tony, he fought for his views, he took his issue right out in meetings after meetings, and too many of us on the right didn't fight for our views. I fought, but perhaps too late, belatedly. I certainly fought from 79 onwards. I went to each of those Labour Party conferences on the floor and challenged all the different policies that they were after. But this is retrospective. The real interesting question you were getting on to is why was Tony Blair turned out to such an authoritarian leader? How did he get away with it in the Labour Party? I mean, to some extent, I'm still
that's the question I
baffled by
wanted
it.
now to pose. Well, let me ask each of you. I mean, it's been fascinating. And you would all praise the way the cabinets were run by Jim Callaghan. I think you've all done that, whatever your other disagreements and so on. We're now in a situation where David poses an interesting question about Tony Blair. Now, as you all would disagree, his defence is that you've got too much to do, it was too inefficient, and it brought out too many divisions the way cabinet government was previously organised. His way wins elections and he can get on and do things. I mean, presumably that would be broadly his defence. So what?
I think that New Labour was founded by three people, Blair, Brown and Mandelson. They sat down and they said to each other, we will never win unless we adopt Thatcher's economic and political policy. And that's what they did. And when Blair became leader, he said, New Labour is a new political party. I'm not a member of New Labour. I'm a member of the Labour Party. I'm not old Labour either. It's not for him to rename my party. And he then decided to impose his will, and the party had been out for so long, they went along with it. And we've had 3 election victories, but I'm still loyally waiting for the election of a Labour government because we haven't had a Labour government. And it's he's followed Mrs. Thatcher was asked her greatest achievement. She said New Labour. Michael Cockrell said to Mrs. Thatcher the other day, tell me how to get on with David Cameron, said, I still prefer Tony Blair. And I think the reality is...
That's an interesting...
Well, the reality is that we're now told to spend our lives now helping Tony Blair to leave a legacy.
It is,
and it's nothing to do with the Labour Party.
The point, most important point Tony makes is the phrase, the cabinet went along with it. In a strange way, I don't blame the Prime Minister for trying to impose his will on the party. That's what Prime Ministers have always done. Prime Minister wants as much power as they possibly get. That's a reasonable position for a Prime Minister to take up. But cabinets are supposed to stop them. I mean, I was a very junior member of the cabinet, much more junior than my colleagues here. But had Jim Callaghan behaved in a way that Tony Blair behaved, I would have said to him, I hope in private, look, there's no point in being a member of the cabinet if we just turn up for 10 minutes and get told what to do. The extraordinary quality of this government is the supine character of the cabinet and the parliamentary and parliamentary. And it's all down to the fact we lost so many elections. We lost 4. And in the old days, when I was being mildly critical of the Prime Minister, remember, from a position which, in the period we're talking about, I was on the right wing of the Labour Party. I was the right wing candidate for everything. When I was criticising the Prime Minister from that point of view, the answer was always, but you lost 4 elections. And that's what's haunted the Labour Party ever since.
But the answer to that is a very simple one. You, Tony Blair, made the biggest political and military blunder of any Prime Minister in our history. Yes. You are responsible for one of the most serious defeats for British life, British political reputation worldwide. And there is no doubt about it that this man's system of government has been a total abysmal failure. And the test for the new Labour Prime Minister, is going to be a Labour Prime Minister, is they learn that lesson and don't carry on with this system. They dismantle it and return to the old verities. It's not just because we're old and decrepit. The cabinet structure came out of a lot of thought in the early part of the century. During the First World War it evolved, and it has served us through some major crises. It came unstuck under Anthony Eden at Suez, and it completely came unglued and totally ineffective during Blair over Iraq.
It is really interesting, given the divisions ideologically, so to speak, between the three of you, that you all agree on this. As Roy said, his defence would partly be that he won elections and you all led to an electoral defeat.
Blindly supported.
But could I just move on to sort of...
Wilson won 3 elections.
4 elections.
Well, he always used to say 4 out of 6.
Yeah,
4, yeah, he won 4, didn't he? Although 74 just.
Well,
but he still won it. He still won it.
Enough.
We began by reflecting on the fact that after Wilson's resignation in 76, a whole group of very senior figures stood for the leadership contest. And I referred, I think, then to the fact that at the moment it seems that the only senior cabinet figure putting himself forward is Gordon Brown. Tony, do you think others... It would be a good thing for the Labour Party and arguably the country if others put themselves forward as people did in 76?
Well, the Liberals elected a new leader, the Tories elected a new leader, and if Labour MPs, by declining to nominate an alternative, allow a new leader to emerge unelected, it will utterly destroy his authority and undermine the whole belief in the Electoral College, which is the thing that Blair was elected by. So there's that. But also, I think, if we're talking about debate, we were talking about a moment ago in Cabinet, I think there is a strain of opinion in the party that needs to be tested in the movement. I mean, I'm a supporter of John McDonnell. He says, withdraw from Iraq, end privatisation, take pensioners off a means test, stop student fees, trade union rights like the 1906 Trade Disputes Act, have civil liberties and a green environmental policy. Now, I think that personally represents my view, and it should be able to be tested with the movement. Even if he doesn't win, there would be that strain of opinion that would be seen to be legitimate within the Labour Party, and that's why I want an election. OK, and Roy, what about the broad focus? John McDonnell has put himself forward. He's not in the Cabinet. In 76, you had all these Cabinet heavyweights coming forward. Do you think it would be good for the Labour Party if Cabinet heavyweights came forward as they did in that contest, which you all reminisce with rather affectionately in 76?
Well, I think it would be good for Gordon Brown. I'm very much a Brown supporter.
But it would be good for Gordon Brown.
But I think it would be a good thing for him if he defeated a real opponent rather than was crowned, as somebody said the other day, as if he were a monarch rather than a party leader. There are difficulties about that in this new situation. Remember, the leadership election we're talking about 31 years ago was in the cosy confines of the Parliamentary Labour Party. I don't know whether you had a campaign in the country, Tony, but most of the candidates didn't. All these candidates, certainly for the deputy leadership, are going to go around the country as if they were presidential candidates in the United States of America, drawing attention to differences of policy. And you see, let's say it was John Reid. Nothing would give me greater pleasure than for Gordon Brown to beat John Reid by about 10-1. But let's assume that it was John Reid. After the election, the Tories would say, well, that's all very well, Prime Minister Brown, but Dr. Reid, or whatever he is, was saying something quite different 2 or 3 months ago. There are dangers about having a campaign, but on balance, I think it would be good for the party, good for the country, and good for Gordon Brown as well.
David, from the safe distance of being outside
I'm a
the
Democrat,
Labour Party,
and I was... Yeah. Every possible pressure was put on me as in the SDP not to have an election and to crown Roy Jenkins. And I fought him, and I'm extremely glad I fought him, and I think it was good for the SDP. So I agree with what they both said. I'm no longer a member of the Labour Party, but I think that a Democratic Party must have elections, and they should be representative elections. We should hear the issues. The country is sensible. Whoever wins, the arguments are folded up, the new Prime Minister can bring in people from different things, and if he's having a cabinet government, he's got every good chance of keeping their unity because they all have their capacity to have their say in the cabinet, and then they own the policy. And they then have to live under this very difficult rubric where you support a policy even when you don't think you agree with it. But you do so because you've been around that table and you own it.
Well, again, agreement on that one. Thank you all very much for coming in this morning to reflect on that fascinating period and the equally interesting contemporary period as well. Who says politics is dull? It never is. Thank you very much indeed for coming in today. And South,
pleasure.
You know, first time you've been in a studio together for a long time, so it's been great. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's all we've got time for this week. If you've just tuned in on ITV1, you can see the whole programme again over on ITV2 very shortly. And we'll see you at the same time, same place next Sunday. So until then, enjoy the rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.